So I want you to imagine a scenario with me for a moment. Right, you go home today and say your house looks a little like this. This is a relatively random Google image of a neighborhood in Illinois. So your house looks like this, right? Nothing fancy, but, nice, it's neat, and it's clean. And, you're there maybe enjoying your lunch, and a rainstorm comes through, right? Something that I know you guys are praying for, a little bit of moisture. And as you're sitting there and enjoying your lunch, you look outside and you notice your gutters are all clogged, right? Water's running over and going places you don't want it to, and really it's not a big deal. It's not the end of the world if you let your gutter stay clogged for a little bit. And so you do nothing about it. And then, as you're coming and going throughout the week, you begin to notice some paint peeling on the outside of your house. And again, not the end of the world, it's just a little thing. And so you ignore it, right? You think, I'll get to that some other time. See on the side of the house there, right, there's some trees kind of beginning to grow. And, they're getting a little bigger and really not in a good place. And again, you kind of ignore it. And, these little things just kind of begin to add up. And eventually all these little things become bigger, but all the little things in of themselves are kind of acceptable to you, right? These are acceptable little maintenance things because you'll get to them later. And again, clogged gutters, peeling paint, little high grass, not a big deal, right? They're acceptable in our eyes. But it's not a big deal until it is a big deal. Because year after year, as you ignore little things like that, they grow, they become big problems. You think, right, it's a little problem, I'll get to it eventually. Yet you never do. And so here's this home on Google Maps, I believe it was in 2008, and check out what it looked like last year. It's not a big deal until it is a big deal. You're not going home to that. Right? One little issue that you ignore, you allow it to grow and to fester, becomes a big issue over time. I was tempted to take some pictures around town of some houses like that. Well, that's a little too personal for us. See, my point is, right, one little small thing, seemingly insignificant, can lead to major consequences if ignored over time. Right, you understand the image there when it comes to our houses and different things that we own, right? We could relate this to many parts of our lives. But this is very true about our own personal lives and about our spiritual lives, right? Maybe you walk in today and your personal life looks like that house. Right? You had some little issues in the past that you ignored, you allowed to fester, you allowed to grow, and now the house of your personal life is a mess. Right? Maybe your marriage is just falling apart. Right? In private, it's falling apart. In public, you play the role. And these little things have added up over time, right? The neglect of your relationship, the poor communication, the selfish heart that you have, and now your marriage looks like that home. Right? Maybe you have a substance abuse issue. And it started out as little, right? A little something just to take the edge off on a Friday evening after a long week. And soon you found yourself consuming that come Monday and Tuesday. And now you are dependent upon it, and it's a big issue that's impacting your life, yet you're great at hiding it. Right? Maybe it's a secret sin, right? Something you're dealing with. Deep. Maybe it's anger, pride. Maybe it's something financially. Maybe it's pornography, right? These little tiny things that seem relatively insignificant, that we would maybe categorize as acceptable sins, as long as you don't do it too long or too much, you don't go too far. These little tiny things can start out small and grow over time. So how does a home go from that first image to something like this? It's tiny little compromises. It's tiny little things that you find to be acceptable, and eventually you grow used to it. Right? Eventually, at some point, they grew used to kind of parting the bushes to get to their home until they realized they can't go home anymore. And again, maybe that's where you are in your personal and spiritual life today. This is not a place that you would even recognize 10 years ago. And it all is because of a category of sin that many of us would maybe put in a bucket of acceptable sins. Right? These are sins that we know aren't right, behaviors and actions, attitudes that we know are not okay, yet we find them acceptable, right? They're kind of the exception, right? We ignore them. We overlook them. We even learn to accept them and live with them, and over time we grow cold to them. We begin to get comfortable with it. We accept them. And it almost gets to the point where you don't even see it as being a problem, right? This is just a part of life. And yet, if you were to maybe revisit your life from 10 years ago, you would walk up on your life and say, how did I get there? Right? These tiny little things that we allow to fester and to grow. Right? Again, just like these homes. How does it go from this to this in a matter of 15 years? One tiny little thing that was ignored, that was allowed to fester and to grow. Our acceptable sins, the things that we put in the category of just okay, this is just what I need, they are absolutely destroying us. Right? We are on our way to looking like that home. It will destroy our personal lives, it destroys our spiritual lives, and it will certainly destroy churches as well. It can destroy this church. And so as we dive into 1 Corinthians, back in week 5, I believe, 1 Corinthians, what Paul addresses in the church is a category of sin that I would say became to them acceptable sins. And these sins are destroying the church. And so we need to kind of evaluate this mindset that allows us to get into a place where we put things in our life into this acceptable sin category. So we're in 1 Corinthians today, looking at chapter 5, and we're going to look through the entirety of the chapter, all 13 verses, again, as we move into week 5 in 1 Corinthians, this series that I entitled From Drift to Direction. Right? The Corinthian church had Paul around for a year and a half. Right? They had great teaching, great mentors of the faith. And he naturally left to go and plant other churches and do ministry at other places. And in his absence, the Corinthian church has begun to drift. Right? We talked about some of the division that they were experiencing. And now what we have here is them allowing sins to creep into their lives and into their church. And Paul knows it's going to destroy the church. And he's helping them understand what it will do to them as a people and what it will do to them as individuals. Right? So part of the drift that they're experiencing was their simple acceptance of sin. Now today, there are a lot of viral challenges that you see online. Right, with the kind of the rise of social media over the past decade and a half, you have things like the Tide Pod Challenge, right, where you download a Tide Pod and don't do that. You have things like the Mannequin Challenge, where someone shouts mannequin, or there's different versions of this where you pause and freeze up. Right, there's lots of different challenges. The Ice Bucket Challenge, right, raising money for a good cause. Some of these things are a little more dangerous than others. When I was in high school, we had the Cinnamon Challenge. But we didn't have phones with cameras. Yeah, I appreciate the nod. You guys remember that? The Cinnamon Challenge, right? And I remember going around offering $20 to anyone who could completely swallow a spoonful of ground cinnamon. And most high school guys are like, oh yeah, I can do that. That's an easy $20. And in their mind, because this was where my mind was, because I was one of those dumb guys that did this as well, I was like, it's like cinnamon sugar. I can do this. But if you ever take a spoonful of cinnamon, ground cinnamon, put it in your mouth, it instantly dries everything out. And like literally the natural reaction is it comes out. It's a mess. You look like a dragon for a moment. In fact, I found a small video online. We'll see if it plays. All right, so that didn't go well. That didn't go well. Here's the thing, right? What would drive a dumb high school guy to do that? Well, they're a dumb high school guy. This is what we do. This is what we did. I think all guys are still in this category. It's the confidence, right? I can do that. It's a spoonful of ground cinnamon. It's the confidence that drives them to take on that challenge. And ultimately, it's the pride, right? I can overcome that. I can do that. That might be an obstacle for everybody else, but it's not for me. And we do it with silly things like that, silly challenges. Some are more innocent than others, right? That's not going to put you in the hospital. It's just going to give you a little shame for a while. The Tide Pod one might put you in the hospital. But here's the thing. When we're talking about our spiritual lives, we operate in many ways just like that. Our overconfidence, our pride makes us blind to the reality that we can do things that we can't or shouldn't. Our pride makes us blind to the reality that we're not as good as we believe. The Corinthian church, as Paul's addressing the issues going on in their lives and in their church, they're very blind to some of the problems going on. They think they're better than they are. They think they're good spiritually. They just have this category of acceptable sins that they are completely blind to. And so Paul writes this chapter to address this mindset, to address this heart issue. Here's your first blank that we need to see when we're talking about what we need to understand about acceptable sins. we need to understand that a prideful heart enables the acceptance of sin. I don't normally do this, but I want to read through the entire chapter first, because sometimes as we run through this, we can kind of dissect it so much, we lose a bit of the flow. So if you would, turn with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 5. I'm going to read through it, and then we're going to come back and note some items going on here. But as we read through it, I want you to notice three different parts. Right? Paul starts out, he's addressing the problem, the acceptable sin in the context of the church. He talks about why this is a problem, and then he also talks about what they are to do about the problem. So let's read through it, and then we'll come back to a number of points. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 1, Paul writes, "It is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, and of a kind that is not tolerated even among the pagans. For a man has his father's wife. And you are arrogant. Ought you not rather to mourn? Let him who has done this be removed from among you. For though absent in body, I am present in spirit. And as if present, I have already pronounced judgment on the one who did such a thing. When you are assembled in the name of the Lord Jesus, and my spirit is present, with the power of our Lord Jesus, you are to deliver this man to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, so that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord. Your boasting is no good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Cleanse out the old leaven, that ye may be a new lump, as you really are unleavened. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Let us therefore celebrate the festival, not with the old leaven, the leaven of malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people, all meaning the sexually immoral of this world, or the greedy and swindlers or idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world. But now I am writing you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brother if he is guilty of sexual immorality or greed, or is an idolater, reviler, drunkard, or swindler, not even to eat with such a one. For what have I to do with judging others? Is it not those inside the church whom you are to judge? God judges those outside. Purge the evil person from among you." There's the full context of what we're looking at today. Like I said, I don't normally read through it, but I want us to get a sense of the flow before we kind of divide it up and kind of break up the sections of this chapter. But Paul is writing this because there have been a group of acceptable sins allowed in the context of the church. And he kind of brings this up at the very beginning. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 1. He says it's actually reported. Right? Someone let Paul know that there is some gross, disgusting things going on in the context of this church. Right? People know about this. This isn't a secret sin going on below the surface. This is well known in the context of the church. So what is the sin? He says, it's reported that there is sexual immorality among you. And I love how he prefaces it this way. It's a kind of sexual immorality, he says, of a kind that is not tolerated even among the pagans. Right, that's quite a dig, right? Even the secular world thinks this is messed up, guys. But clearly you guys don't, right? You guys are so blind to what's going on. He says, for a man has his father's wife, right? You have a son having relations with his stepmom, right? Even the pagan world says, that's messed up, dude. And so Paul is calling them out on the sin. And here's what I want you to see. He's not just calling out one individual. That you there in verse 2 is a plural you. It's not you as an individual. It's not you as a group of people. It's you as the entire church. You've known about this and you've done nothing about it. And he says, and you are arrogant. You are arrogant. Phosio, the language of being puffed up, being made proud. The idea that they have this exaggerated self-conception of themselves. He says, you guys think you're so awesome. You think you're doing so well, yet you got this gross sin taking place in a public context, and you have done nothing about it. Your pride has made you blind to the reality of this sin. You have become acceptant of this sin. You've done nothing about it. You're not just prideful, you're arrogant. And I kind of wonder as I look at this, what would have caused a group of people to ignore this? Because Paul, as he's continuing on here, says, ought you not rather to mourn? Let him who has done this be removed from among you. Again, the plural you. It's not one individual he's calling out. He's calling out an entire group of people. I read this, I was like, How does a church get from Paul being there for a year and a half, probably on pretty solid ground, to, with his removal after a period of time, allowing this to take place among their body? Right? You got that subtle drift, right? These excuses they made up, the acceptable sins. And I wonder if they just figured, right, they learned, hey, God is gracious and God is forgiving, so God will provide grace and forgive this sin, which he will. But that's not the problem. The problem is they're allowing it to continue to fester. It's not permission to sin. Maybe I wonder if this man and this woman or the family was very important members in the community and the church. And so the rest of the church didn't want to directly address this obvious sin. Right? Maybe they were just happy they just showed up in their body. Maybe they just figured it wasn't that big of a deal, right? A lot of other churches maybe around aren't doing well. Maybe the world looks a lot like this. So they could easily come up with an excuse. And again, I just kind of imagine, right, what made them get to that point where they see this going on in their body and they allow it to continue. A prideful heart enables the acceptance of sin. And we can do the same thing in our lives, right? I'm not aware of that going on in our community or in our church. We would address that. But in the same way, right, we can rationalize our sin away. We can compare ourselves to others, right? This group of acceptable sins. Yeah, it's okay that I'm having this extra relationship outside of my marriage. A lot of people do it, right? It's okay that I'm partaking in this substance every single day and I'm dependent on it. A lot of people do it. It's okay, I open up my phone and I view websites I shouldn't be engaged in because I just need to, because a lot of people do it, right? We can rationalize our sin away, right? I'm not as bad as that person. I won't go as far as they'll go, right? Maybe we rationalize it away because we feel like we deserve it, right? People just don't know what I'm going through, right? God will just forgive me anyway, right? These are the things that allow us to rationalize this type of behavior and get us to a place where we have certain sins in our life that are fully acceptable. And then again, notice the language Paul uses. I mean, it's a very strong language there. You are arrogant. You are prideful. You are completely blind. This is a major, major problem. And just like the Corinthian church, we think very highly of ourselves, and I'm pointing at myself as well. Right? We're blind often to how broken we truly are. Because again, we create this little category of acceptable sins, right? This little pocket of what we want to do, and it's okay as long as we don't go past a certain line. But the reality is you will go past that line. It will grow. It will fester. Somewhere along the line, this started as an innocent relationship and was allowed to bloom and fester. And the same thing happens in our lives as well. So if one thing we need to understand about acceptable sins, this category of sins that we ignore or accept, is it's enabled by a prideful and arrogant heart, thinking much more highly of ourselves than we actually are. Now, I want to go back to that house image I gave at the beginning. If you're like me, right, when you see little things like gutters being clogged, trees growing up by the foundation of your house, again, nothing you got to address today, but you recognize and hopefully realize that with your home, that can become a real problem over time. And so what you do is you go and address those problems as timely as you can, right? You unclog the gutters, you clear out that brush, right? You put some paint on the house, right? Maybe you replace a few shingles if you have a leak. But you recognize this as important because you know that the simple neglect of your home can lead to major problems. Right? We believe it's important, so we take it seriously. And the reality is, as human beings, when it comes to our sin lives, if we perceive something as being important, we will address it. If we realize that little sin that we allow to fester in our life can have some real deep consequences, we will be quick to address it. And if we're not quick to address it, that means we don't think it's that important. And so that brings me to my next point. We will often overlook the sins that we have decided are not that serious. This is something we need to understand about acceptable sins. We don't find them as serious, so we don't address them, so it allows them to fester and to grow. Check out what Paul says about dealing with this. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 3. For though absent in body, I am present in spirit, and as if present, I have already pronounced judgment on the one who did such a thing, which I love, right? He's getting this correspondence via letter, and Paul's like, I don't even need to hear anything else about the story. I don't need to show up and investigate it for myself, figure out why this relationship's going on, why you guys think it's acceptable. He's like, I need no other information other than tell you this is messed up and you need to deal with it. He goes on in verse 4, when you are assembled in the name of the Lord and my spirit is present, and the power of our Lord Jesus, check out what he tells the church to do with this man. You are to deliver this man to Satan for the destruction of the flesh. And here's why, right? We're not just tossing them out because we think we're better than, but we know it does something to their heart and their spirit to get their attention, so that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord. So Paul is telling them to deal with this issue and to deal with it quickly, right? He says, I don't need to show up to investigate. I'm telling you now, this is messed up, and you as a church need to deal with it. This comes into a category that we even enact in the New Testament church that of practice that we would call church discipline. So this would be any person who is committed to membership at a church, and every church does this a little differently, but committed to membership of the church, committed to a form of accountability. And if you are living in gross, obvious public sin, the church's responsibility is to help you deal with that. And if you don't want to deal with it, the church's responsibility is to tell you to get out of there. Right? And Paul will kind of explain a little further why this is so important for the individual and the church itself. And again, some churches practice this well. Some churches don't practice this at all. And some churches practice this too much. And so each church has kind of got to decide how to practice church discipline. Right? We're not concerned about a small spat you had with your spouse. But if you have some gross, negligent behavior going on that's very public, it needs to be dealt with in a public way. And so this is kind of the gist of it, right? The whole church knew about this relationship with this man and this woman. So it's got to be dealt with in a public manner. And again, we'll get on here in a moment about why this is important. But Paul continues. We're going to skip forward a little bit. Verse 9 through 13. It's kind of neat. I'm not sure if you know this. 1 Corinthians is not the first letter to the Corinthian church. It's just the first letter that we have preserved for us, because he alludes to another letter he wrote before this. He says, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. Clearly, Paul has been going back and forth with these people for a while. And clearly, they misunderstood what he was talking about. It says, you were not at all meaning the sexually immoral of the world, or the greedy and the swindlers or idolaters, since you would need to go out of the world. But now I am writing to you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brother if he is guilty of sexual immorality or greed, and you can kind of go down the list. Clearly, there was some confusion. All right, we are not to associate with anybody in the world, and Paul says that's impossible, right? You're going to associate with people who are dealing with gross sins. But what he says there is there's a difference of how we deal with individuals based upon the name that they claim. He says if they bear the name of brother, if they call themselves a follower of Jesus and they're engaged in a large public sin like this, you are to separate yourself from them. Which is kind of interesting, right? God holds his people to a much different standard than he does the world. And he calls his people to deal with the sin, and if they're unwilling, then the church has to separate themselves from him. We will address what we perceive as being important. And Paul here is letting them know that this is incredibly important for you to take this sin seriously. I think it's kind of interesting. I think in my mind, I was kind of wrestling with this this week. Often we again create this category of acceptable sins. We think it's not that big of a deal, and then God kind of hit me, kind of convicted me of some stuff in my own life, in my mindset about this. Right? We think some sins are just a little better than others, or not as bad as others. But if my sin was a big enough deal for Christ to die for, then my sin is a big enough deal for me to actually address. And this is, again, why Paul says this is so incredibly important, particularly for the individual who calls themselves a follower of Jesus, right? Deal with that sin in your life. And the application of this is hard. It's very hard, but it's also very clear. It is hard sometimes for churches to practice church discipline, right? Sometimes churches like to kind of sweep it under the rug, saying God forgives and he provides grace, which he does, but when the sin is as public and as obvious as this, the church has to deal with it. Right, tossing people out is not something any church likes to do. And we don't do this because we're imperfect. because we think we're better than, but we do this because the purity of the church matters. If we claim to be followers of Jesus, then sins like this should disturb us. Right? We all are dealing with sin, but the reality is we're hopefully not staying in it. A prideful heart enables the acceptance of sin, and we'll often overlook the sins that we have decided are not that serious. For a short season after high school, I worked for a construction company where we did land development. We put in water lines, sewer lines, storm drains. I was primarily on the storm drain crew, and so I'd get down in the hole. I was the smallest and the newest guy, and so I was down in the hole mudding up joints and quickly realized I need to do something else in my life. But what I would do, right, we had to show up for work at 7 in the morning, and we worked till 4, right, 9-hour days. And we would get about a 30-minute lunch break. And so you really didn't have a whole lot of time to go get anything, to make anything. And so when I was 17, I thought it was pretty clever. I would bring my lunch, and I would put it on my dash before I went out to work, right? This is Florida in the summer, and so it gets hot. And so what I would do is I'd warm my food up that way, and I'd come back, and it's warm. And some of you are already making faces because I would often even bring leftovers. I have a distinct memory of bringing some leftover fried chicken and putting it on the dash and coming back 5 hours later and eating it. And surprisingly did not get sick. In hindsight, I'm like, that is disgusting. That's like a germ, a huge germ just multiplying there for me to come back and eat. Right? One little germ right, can multiply over the course of a few hours and create a major problem. Right? Just like, right, one little acceptable sin that we allow to continue in our life can grow over time and create major problems for us personally and for our witness and for this church. Right? I want you to understand, if it's not clear yet, acceptable sins can destroy a church. Acceptable sins can destroy a church. And what we need to understand about acceptable sins is that we will grow unconcerned about how our sin impacts others. If we have a category of acceptable sins in our life, we begin to not care as much about the spiritual life of other people. I think part of this is out of shame. We know we're struggling with something, or we've allowed certain things just to be acceptable in our life, so why can't someone else have acceptable sins? And so when we create this category of acceptable sins, we begin to get less concerned about other people and how our sin impacts others. Paul has this illustration of cooking, right? A little leaven, right? Leaven's the whole lump. So he starts there in verse 7. Cleanse out the old leaven that you may be a new lump. It's a nice endearing term. You're a lump. As you really are unleavened. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Let us therefore celebrate the festival, not with old leaven, and the leaven of malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Paul's point and the importance of us dealing with sin in our life is that a little sin can infect the entire purity of an entire church. Right? One little germ on that leftover chicken on the dash can spread and multiply in the course of a few hours and make you very sick. Right? One little sin, again, allowing to fester and to grow, can impact the entire body of a church. The sin infects the whole church. And sometimes, again, we create this category of acceptable sins because we believe it doesn't hurt anybody. All right, again, substance abuse, right? Maybe you're drinking too much, engaging in recreational drugs, and you believe, hey, it's not hurting anybody, so it's okay. Right? But you are hurting someone, right? You're guaranteed hurting relationships. You're hurting your health. You're hurting yourself, and a lot of people care about you. Right? Opening up pornography on your phone, you're like, I'm not hurting anybody at all. These individuals were consenting. It's okay. It's acceptable. But you are hurting your relationships both now and in the future. And you are hurting those individuals who are filming that. Right? The anger, the bitterness, and the pride, you say, I'm keeping it to myself. It doesn't hurt anybody. But it does grow, and it manifests, and it hurts everybody. There is not a category of sin that doesn't hurt someone else. They absolutely hurt. They hurt you in your ability to minister to others, both in this church and in your home. So, what kind of acceptable sins do you have in your life? Right? How does it actually impact your ability to minister and love others? How does it impact your family? Many of us have seen homes like the one I had shown you, right? When it goes from small maintenance things to major problems where you're not living there anymore. But we've also seen homes that look like that have been completely remodeled and refurbished. Right? Someone had to do a major renovation to get a house looking from a dump to a house you want to go back and live in. A major renovation is required. And maybe some of us need to do a major renovation in our life as well. The home that we are living in a rhetorical perspective or metaphorical perspective is a mess. And we need to do a serious renovation. In order to kind of maybe help us with processing what needs to take place in our life, I have two questions for us. And I think every one of us should be able to answer these. Number one, what sin in your life are you prone to accept? And how does that sin impact others? Paul clearly took sin very seriously as he's addressing the Corinthian church. And he's also using it as an illustrative tool to remind the church that this is a big deal because it impacts not only you, but everyone around you. Let's bow our heads in a word of prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for this opportunity to open up your word and to read this letter that Paul wrote to your church so many years ago. And it's just as applicable to us today. Because, God, every single one of us have a category of acceptable sins in our life that we overlook, that we ignore, that we've grown comfortable with, and we think is just special. But, Lord, help us to realize what this does to us as individuals, what it does to our families and those that we lead, and, Lord, what it does to your church. Lord, your people that you died for. So, Lord, I just pray for us today. Help us to get serious about dealing with this category of sin. And, Lord, help it not to grow beyond where it's at today. Lord, do what you need to do to get our attention. And give us grace as you do that. But, Lord, help us become better followers of you. In your amazing name, amen.